In the spring of 1846, picture yourself standing at the edge of the American frontier in 1846, where the scent of pine and distant wood smoke mingles with the crisp mountain air. The Sierra Nevada stretches before you like a granite wall, its peaks crowned with snow that never seems to melt, even in summer's warmth. This is a landscape both beautiful and merciless, where the line between triumph and tragedy is as thin as the oxygen at altitude. In the spring of 1846, families across the Missouri frontier were preparing for what they believed would be a journey toward prosperity and new beginnings. The promise of California's fertile valleys and mild climate had captured the imagination of countless Americans, and among them were the Donner and Reed families, along with dozens of other hopeful emigrants. They could not have known that their names would become forever linked with one of the most harrowing survival stories in American history. The wagon trains that departed from Independence, Missouri that year carried more than just household goods and farming equipment. They carried dreams, ambitions, and the unshakable belief that the West offered something better than what they were leaving behind. The rhythm of their preparations was methodical and hopeful. Barrels of flour and salt pork, carefully wrapped medicines, children's toys tucked between essential supplies, and letters from loved ones folded into Bible pages. But the Sierra Nevada cared nothing for human ambition. This ancient range had witnessed countless seasons of plenty and scarcity, and it would test these emigrants in ways they could never have imagined. The story of the Donner Party is not simply one of survival against impossible odds, but a window into the complex psychology of desperation, the fragility of civilization, and the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go to preserve life itself. As we journey through their experience, you'll discover how a series of seemingly minor decisions and delays transformed what should have been a routine, if challenging, migration into 87 days of unimaginable hardship. The snow that began falling in October 1846 would trap these families in a landscape that offered little mercy, forcing them to confront not only the elements, but the very essence of what it means to be human when all familiar comforts are stripped away. Tonight we'll walk alongside the Donner Party as they make their fateful journey westward, through the eyes of those who lived it and the historians who have pieced together their story from diary entries, letters, and testimonies that survived when many of their authors did not. This is their story, a tale of ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes, where the warmth of human compassion flickered like firelight against the cold indifference of the natural world. The morning of April 15, 1846, dawned clear and mild in Springfield, Illinois, as George Donner loaded the last of his family's belongings onto their prairie schooner. The wagon groaned under the weight of carefully chosen possessions: a rocking chair his wife Tamsin had insisted upon, bolts of fabric for the new life they would build in California, and $3,000 in cash sewn into a quilt, more money than most families would see in a lifetime. George, at 62, was past the age when most men would consider such an undertaking, but his optimism was infectious, and his belief in California's promise unwavering. Tamsin Donner, 45, and pregnant with their fourth child, possessed a keen intelligence and a teacher's instinct for preparation. She had packed books, watercolors, and writing materials, envisioning herself documenting their grand adventure and perhaps establishing a school in their new home. Her 3 daughters, 14-year-old Elitha, 13-year-old Liana, and 3-year-old Frances, helped arrange their smaller possessions with the careful attention children bring to important tasks. The wagon became a mobile home, every inch serving a purpose, every item chosen with deliberate care. Imagine yourself witnessing the departure of the Donner Party from Springfield that April morning. The scene would have been both festive and solemn. Families gathering to say farewells that might be permanent, while the emigrants themselves buzzed with nervous energy and excitement. The sound of creaking leather, the gentle lowing of oxen, and the voices of children calling to friends created a symphony of departure that had become familiar across America's frontier towns. James Reed, George Donner's friend and traveling companion, had spared no expense in preparing for the journey. His wagon, which the family had nicknamed the Pioneer Palace Car, was a marvel of frontier engineering. Standing 9 feet high and equipped with sleeping quarters, a stove, and even a small library, it represented Reed's determination to bring civilization with him to the wilderness. His wife Margaret, who suffered from chronic headaches and fatigue, would travel in relative comfort, while their 4 children, Virginia, Patty, James Jr., and Tommy, viewed the massive wagon as their castle on wheels. The Reed family's affluence was evident in every detail of their preparation. They traveled with hired hands, extra oxen, and provisions that would last well beyond the anticipated 4-month journey. James Reed had studied the available guidebooks, particularly Lansford Hastings' The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which promised a shorter route that would save precious time and miles. The idea of reducing their journey by several hundred miles appealed to Reed's practical nature, though he could not have known that this decision would prove to be their undoing. As the wagon train formed in the early morning light, other families joined the Donner and Reed groups. The Breens, a large Irish Catholic family led by Patrick Breen, had sold his land to finance the journey, and his wife Peggy traveled with their 7 children, ranging in age from infant to teenager. The rhythm of their daily prayers would later provide structure and comfort during the darkest days ahead. The Graves family, headed by Franklin Graves, had recently arrived from Illinois with their own dreams of California prosperity. Franklin, a gunsmith by trade, knew his skills would be valuable in the frontier settlements, and he traveled with his wife Elizabeth and their 9 children. The wagon train grew as they progressed, collecting families and individuals who shared the common goal of reaching California before winter set in. Among the most intriguing members of the party was Louis Keseberg, a German immigrant whose imposing physical presence and strong opinions often put him at odds with his fellow travelers. Keseberg traveled with his wife Philippine and their 2 young children, carrying with him both the hope of American prosperity and the cultural distance that sometimes made him seem aloof to his companions. His fluency in multiple languages and his practical skills made him valuable to the group, though his personality would later become a source of significant controversy. The early days of the journey unfolded with the steady rhythm that characterized westward migration. Each morning brought the same routine: breakfast cooked over campfires, oxen yoked and hitched, wagons loaded and secured. The emigrants would typically rise before dawn, and by 7 o'clock the cry of "Wagons ho!" would echo across the prairie as the train began its daily progress.
The pace was deliberately measured, 15 to 20 miles per day over relatively flat terrain, allowing the animals to maintain their strength and the travelers to adjust to the demands of trail life. The landscape they traversed in those early weeks was the familiar prairie of the American Midwest, rolling grasslands that stretched to the horizon under vast skies. Spring wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the weather remained generally favorable, reinforcing their optimism about the journey ahead. Children gathered buffalo chips for fuel, women prepared meals from their carefully rationed stores, and men tended to the endless mechanical needs of wagons and animals. The social dynamics of the wagon train began to establish themselves during these early weeks. James Reed, with his fine clothes and expensive equipment, naturally assumed a leadership role, though his sometimes imperious manner occasionally created friction with other members of the party. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, were respected for their practical wisdom and generous nature, while Patrick Breen's steady faith and Franklin Graves' frontier skills earned them their own followings within the group. As they progressed across Missouri and into Kansas territory, the emigrants began to encounter the first signs of the challenges that lay ahead. River crossings required careful planning and execution, with wagons sometimes breaking down under the strain of fording swollen streams. The constant wear on equipment meant that repairs were a daily necessity, and the emigrants quickly learned to be resourceful with their tools and materials.
The trail they followed had been worn by thousands of previous emigrants, creating a pathway that was both a comfort and a reminder of the vast distances yet to be covered. Abandoned furniture and equipment littered the route, testimony to the difficult decisions travelers had been forced to make when their wagons became overloaded or their animals grew weak. The Donner Party passed these markers of previous struggles with a mixture of sympathy and confidence, certain that their own careful preparation would spare them such hardships. But it was during these early weeks that the first fateful decision was made. When the party reached the Little Sandy River in present-day Wyoming, they encountered a junction in the trail. The established route continued northwest toward Fort Hall, while a newer path, marked by a sign promoting Hastings Cutoff, promised a more direct route to California. The sign claimed that taking this alternate route would save 300 miles and several weeks of travel time. James Reed, consulting his copy of Hastings' guidebook, became an advocate for taking the cutoff. The book described the route in glowing terms, emphasizing the time savings and the beauty of the country through which it passed. Other members of the party were more skeptical, preferring the proven route that had been successfully traveled by thousands of emigrants before them. The debate that ensued reflected the democratic nature of wagon train decision-making, but also revealed the personality conflicts that would later prove so destructive. The choice to take Hastings Cutoff represented more than a simple route selection. It embodied the optimism and ambition that had driven these families to leave their established lives in the first place. The promise of saving time and distance appealed to their practical nature, while the idea of pioneering a new route satisfied their sense of adventure. They could not have known that Hastings himself had never actually traveled the route he was promoting, and that the cutoff would prove to be longer and more difficult than the established trail.
As July turned to August, the Donner Party found themselves in the Wasatch Mountains of present-day Utah, struggling through terrain that bore no resemblance to the easy passage described in their guidebook. The road was often nothing more than a rough track that required constant clearing and improvement. Men spent days chopping through dense brush and moving rocks, while the oxen crept forward at a pace that sometimes measured progress in yards rather than miles. The physical demands of the cutoff began to take their toll on both humans and animals. The oxen, already weakened by the long journey, struggled under the additional burden of pulling wagons through increasingly difficult terrain. Equipment failures became more frequent, and the emigrants found themselves having to lighten their loads, abandoning treasured possessions to lighten the burden on their struggling teams. Tempers began to fray as the promised benefits of the cutoff failed to materialize. The democratic decision-making that had characterized the early part of the journey gave way to more heated debates and personality conflicts. James Reed, who had been the primary advocate for the cutoff, found himself increasingly isolated as other members of the party questioned his judgment. The stress of the difficult travel conditions began to reveal character traits that had been hidden during the easier early stages of the journey.
The rhythm of their daily lives became dominated by the simple struggle to make progress. Where once they had enjoyed the luxury of midday rest stops and evening socializing, now every available hour was devoted to moving forward through the challenging terrain. The children, who had initially viewed the journey as a grand adventure, began to sense the growing tension among the adults and the increasing difficulty of their circumstances. It was during this period that the first serious accident occurred. While the party was struggling through a particularly difficult section of the Wasatch Mountains, a wagon belonging to the Reed family overturned, destroying some of their supplies and injuring several oxen. The accident was relatively minor in terms of immediate damage, but it served as a sobering reminder of how quickly circumstances could change on the frontier. The landscape around them began to change as well, becoming more arid and desolate as they approached the Great Salt Lake Desert. The grass that had sustained their animals became sparse and poor, forcing them to carry water and fodder for increasingly long stretches. The desert crossing that lay ahead of them was described in their guidebook as a simple day's journey, but the reality would prove far more challenging. As they prepared to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert in late August, the Donner Party was already behind schedule and running low on the reserves of energy and supplies they had counted on for the journey. The desert crossing would prove to be another turning point in their journey, one that would push them even further behind schedule and closer to the disaster that awaited them in the Sierra Nevada. The decisions made during these early weeks of the journey, the choice to take Hastings' cutoff, the delays caused by difficult terrain, the gradual depletion of their resources, would prove to be the foundation of the tragedy that followed. But as they prepared to cross the desert, the emigrants still believed that they could make up lost time and reach California before winter set in. The human capacity for optimism in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary would prove to be both their salvation and their doom. The morning of August 6, 1846, found the Donner Party camped at the mouth of Echo Canyon, staring up at walls of red rock that rose like ancient cathedrals against the pale sky. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable. Towering formations carved by millennia of wind and water, their surfaces painted in shades of rust and gold,
that seemed to glow in the early light. But beauty, as the emigrants were beginning to understand, could be deceptive in the wilderness. Lansford Hastings had finally caught up with the party after leaving cryptic notes along the trail, and his presence should have been reassuring. Instead, his demeanor carried an uncomfortable urgency that contradicted the confident tone of his published guidebook. When he examined the terrain ahead, his expression grew troubled, and he admitted that the route would require significant trail building through areas where no wagon had ever passed. The revelation that they would essentially be pioneering their own road through the Wasatch Mountains came as a shock to emigrants who had expected a well-established path. Imagine yourself standing among the men as they gathered around Hastings that morning, the scent of coffee and bacon drifting from the breakfast fires, while families prepared for another day of travel. The guide's words would have fallen like stones into still water, creating ripples of concern that spread through the group. James Reed, who had been the primary advocate for the cutoff, found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending a decision that was beginning to look increasingly unwise.
The work that lay ahead would transform the emigrants from travelers into road builders, a role for which they were neither prepared nor equipped. The men organized themselves into crews, some cutting brush and small trees, others moving rocks and filling holes that could break a wagon axle. The women and children took on the additional burden of managing the livestock and preparing meals under increasingly difficult conditions. The rhythm of their days changed from the steady progress of trail travel to the back-breaking labor of creating a passage through wilderness that seemed determined to resist their efforts. The Wasatch Mountains tested every aspect of their preparation and character. Steep grades required multiple teams of oxen to pull a single wagon, while narrow passages demanded precise maneuvering that took hours to accomplish. The sound of axes and saws echoed through the canyons from dawn to dusk, punctuated by the groaning of wagon wheels and the occasional crash of a falling tree. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, and each day brought new obstacles that required creative solutions. Virginia Reed, James Reed's 13-year-old daughter, would later write about the peculiar beauty of their surroundings during this period, how the morning light would paint the canyon walls in brilliant colors, and how the sound of their voices would echo back from the rocks like conversations with invisible companions. But even a child's natural optimism was tempered by the growing realization that they were far behind schedule and still facing unknown challenges ahead. The physical demands of the mountain crossing began to reshape the social dynamics of the party. Men who had been respected for their leadership abilities found themselves struggling with the manual labor required to build a road, while others who had seemed less significant revealed unexpected skills and stamina. The democratic decision-making that had characterized the early part of the journey gave way to more authoritarian structures as the urgency of their situation became apparent. Louis Caseberg, the German immigrant whose imposing presence had sometimes made others uncomfortable, proved to be remarkably skilled at solving the engineering problems posed by the terrain. His ability to visualize how to move a wagon through a seemingly impossible passage earned him grudging respect from men who had previously kept their distance. The crisis was beginning to reveal both the best and worst in human nature, as the stress of their circumstances stripped away the social conventions that had governed their interactions.
By late August, after more than 2 weeks of grueling work, the party finally emerged from the Wasatch Mountains onto the shores of the Great Salt Lake. The vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon should have been a moment of triumph, but the emigrants were too exhausted and behind schedule to celebrate. Their animals were weakened by the difficult crossing, their supplies were running low, and the desert that lay ahead of them promised even greater challenges. The Great Salt Lake Desert presented a landscape that seemed almost alien to people accustomed to the green abundance of the American Midwest. The ground was covered with a hard crust of salt that reflected the sun's rays like a mirror, creating a glare that hurt their eyes and made it difficult to judge distances. The air shimmered with heat waves that created mirages, making distant mountains appear to dance and waver like dreams. There was no grass for the animals, no fresh water for miles, and no shelter from the relentless sun.
Hastings' guidebook had described the desert crossing as a simple day's journey, but the reality proved far more challenging. The hard-packed salt that looked so solid from a distance often concealed soft spots that could trap a wagon wheel or cause an ox to stumble. The party was forced to travel primarily at night, when the temperature dropped to bearable levels, while resting during the day in whatever shade they could find or create. The crossing began on the evening of August 27th, with the emigrants loading their wagons with extra water and feed for what they hoped would be a single night's journey. The procession of wagons moving across the white expanse under starlight created an eerie and beautiful scene. Dark shapes creeping across a landscape that seemed to belong more to dreams than reality. The only sounds were the creaking of wheels, the breathing of animals, and the soft conversations of drivers trying to maintain their direction in the darkness. But dawn revealed that they had covered far less distance than anticipated, and the mountains that marked the western edge of the desert still seemed impossibly far away. The day grew hot with an intensity that none of them had experienced before, and the reflection of the sun off the salt crust created a furnace-like environment that sapped the strength of both humans and animals. The oxen began to show signs of distress, their tongues hanging out as they struggled to pull their heavy loads across the increasingly difficult terrain. James Reed, recognizing the severity of their situation, made the difficult decision to abandon his elaborate palace car and consolidate his family's possessions into a smaller wagon. The magnificent vehicle that had been his pride and joy was left behind on the salt flats, its fine appointments and comfortable quarters suddenly meaningless in the face of survival. The decision represented more than just a practical necessity. It was a symbolic acknowledgement that their journey had moved beyond the realm of civilized travel into something far more primitive and dangerous. The second night of the crossing proved even more challenging than the first. Several oxen collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, forcing their owners to abandon wagons and consolidate their possessions with other families. The carefully planned loads that had been so methodically packed in Springfield were hastily redistributed, with precious family heirlooms left behind to make room for essential supplies. The desert was claiming not just their animals and wagons, but the very foundations of their domestic lives. By the third day, the situation had become desperate. The emigrants were scattered across miles of desert, with some families pushing ahead while others fell behind, their animals too weak to continue. The social cohesion that had held the party together began to fragment under the stress of survival.
Some men abandoned their wagons and walked ahead on foot, hoping to find water and return with help, while others remained with their families, unwilling to risk separation in the hostile environment. The landscape around them seemed to mock their efforts with its desolate beauty. The salt formations created sculptures that looked like frozen waves or ancient ruins, while the distant mountains shimmered in the heat like promises that might never be fulfilled. The silence was profound, an absence of sound that seemed to press against their ears and make their own voices seem small and insignificant. It was during this crossing that the first serious conflicts within the party began to emerge. The stress of the desert, combined with the exhaustion and dehydration, began to reveal personality traits that had been hidden during the easier parts of the journey. Arguments broke out over the distribution of water, the pace of travel, and the decisions that had brought them to this desperate situation. The democratic spirit that had characterized their early journey gave way to more autocratic decision-making as the urgency of survival took precedence over consensus. The Donner families, traveling toward the rear of the train, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position as their animals weakened and their water supplies dwindled. George Donner, despite his age and the burden of leadership, remained outwardly optimistic. But his private conversations with his brother Jacob revealed growing concern about their ability to reach California before winter. The thought of being trapped in the mountains by snow was beginning to haunt the emigrants, though few spoke of it openly. Tamsin Donner, now obviously pregnant and struggling with the physical demands of the journey, continued to maintain her dignity and composure despite the increasingly primitive conditions. Her 3 daughters looked to her for reassurance, and she provided it with a grace that belied her own fears. The family dynamics that had seemed so stable during the comfortable early weeks of the journey were being tested by circumstances that none of them had anticipated. The rescue came on the 4th day, when men who had pushed ahead on foot returned with fresh oxen and water from the Carson River. The sight of these rescuers appearing through the heat waves was like a vision of salvation to the stranded emigrants. But the relief was tempered by the realization of how much they had lost. Animals, wagons, and precious time that could never be recovered. The final tally of the desert crossing was sobering. The party had lost dozens of oxen, several wagons, and countless personal possessions. More importantly, they had lost nearly a week of precious time and had exhausted their reserves of strength and supplies. The desert had been a test that revealed both the fragility of their preparations and the resilience of their spirits. But it had also pushed them dangerously close to the edge of disaster. As they rested on the banks of the Carson River, the emigrants tried to reorganize their diminished resources and assess their situation. The lush grass and fresh water were a welcome relief after the ordeal of the desert, but the calendar was their enemy. September was well advanced, and the Sierra Nevada still lay ahead of them. The snow that could trap them in the mountains was only weeks away, and they had no margin for error. The crossing of the Great Salt Lake Desert had transformed the Donner Party from confident emigrants into desperate survivors. The comfortable assumptions about their journey had been stripped away, leaving them with a stark understanding of their vulnerability in the face of the wilderness. The decisions they would make in the coming weeks would determine whether they would reach California as planned or become trapped in the mountains by the early winter that was already gathering in the high peaks ahead. The rhythm of their daily lives had been permanently altered by the desert crossing. Where once they had enjoyed the luxury of regular meals and comfortable rest, now every resource was carefully rationed and every decision weighed against the possibility of further delays. The children, who had initially found the journey exciting, began to sense the growing desperation of their parents and the increasing urgency of their situation. As they prepared to continue their journey toward the Sierra Nevada, the emigrants carried with them not just their diminished supplies and weakened animals, but also the psychological weight of their recent ordeal. The desert had shown them that the landscape itself could be an enemy, and that their survival depended on more than just preparation and determination. The mountains ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, and the lessons learned in the salt flats would prove to be only the beginning of their education in the harsh realities of wilderness survival. The Great Salt Lake Desert had been a crucible that burned away their illusions and left them with a stark understanding of their situation. They were no longer tourists passing through a scenic landscape, but refugees fleeing toward an uncertain sanctuary. The transformation was complete, and the Donner Party that emerged from the desert was fundamentally different from the confident group that had entered it. The question now was whether they could reach the safety of California before winter made their situation impossible. The morning of September 30th, 1846, found the Donner Party camped along the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada. Their diminished caravan stretched along the banks of a waterway that had become their lifeline through the desert country. The cottonwood trees along the river provided welcome shade, and the grass, though sparse, offered some relief for their weakened animals. But the calendar was their constant enemy. October was upon them, and the Sierra Nevada still lay ahead like a granite wall between them and safety.
The routine of their days had settled into a pattern of grim efficiency. The leisurely pace of the early journey was now a memory, replaced by the urgent rhythm of survival. They rose before dawn, broke camp quickly, and pushed forward with a determination born of desperation. The conversations around the evening fires had changed as well. Where once they had discussed the prospects awaiting them in California, now they spoke in hushed tones about the weather, the condition of their animals, and the dwindling supplies that would have to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. James Reed, despite the criticism he had faced for advocating the cutoff, remained one of the most capable members of the party. His expensive equipment was mostly gone, abandoned in the desert or traded for more essential supplies, but his intelligence and determination had not diminished. He spent long hours each evening studying the crude maps available to them, trying to calculate distances and estimate how much time they might have before the mountain passes became impassable. The psychological toll of their ordeal was beginning to manifest in ways both subtle and obvious. Children who had been excited by the adventure of the early journey now clung more closely to their parents, sensing the anxiety that permeated the adult conversations. The women, who had initially found time for social visits and shared domestic tasks,
were now consumed with the basic necessities of keeping their families fed and their possessions organized in the increasingly cramped wagons. It was during this period that the first serious violence erupted within the party. The incident began as a disagreement between James Reed and John Snyder, one of the teamsters hired to help drive the wagons. The argument escalated when Snyder's oxen got entangled with Reed's team at a difficult river crossing, and tensions that had been building for weeks finally exploded into physical confrontation. The fight itself was brief, but shocking in its intensity. Snyder, a young man with a reputation for a quick temper, struck Reed with his whip handle, opening a gash on his head that immediately began to bleed. Reed, perhaps acting on instinct, or perhaps driven by weeks of accumulated frustration, drew his hunting knife and stabbed Snyder in the chest. The young teamster collapsed immediately, his life flowing out onto the dusty ground beside the river. Imagine yourself witnessing this moment of violence, the sudden silence that followed Snyder's fall, the way the other emigrants gathered around his body with a mixture of shock and horror. The reality of death had been an abstract possibility during the early part of their journey, but now it stood among them with brutal immediacy. The sound of Snyder's final breath seemed to echo in the desert air, and the sight of his blood soaking into the earth served as a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change in the wilderness. The aftermath of the killing created a crisis that threatened to tear the party apart. Some members, led by Lewis Keseberg, demanded that Reed be hanged for murder. Others, including the Donner brothers, argued that Reed had acted in self-defense and that they could not afford to lose another capable man. The debate raged through the night, with voices raised in anger and fear as the emigrants struggled to maintain some semblance of justice and order in their desperate circumstances.
The decision ultimately reached represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Reed would be banished from the party, forced to continue to California on horseback without his family, who would remain with the wagons under the protection of the other emigrants. The sentence was harsh but not fatal, and it reflected the party's recognition that they could not afford the luxury of perfect justice in their current situation. The morning of Reed's departure was heavy with unspoken emotions. Margaret Reed, already weakened by her chronic illness, watched her husband prepare to leave with a stoicism that belied her inner turmoil. The children, particularly Virginia, struggled to understand why their father was being sent away when they needed him most. Reed himself maintained his composure, promising to reach California safely and send back help for the rest of the party. As Reed rode away toward the west, disappearing into the morning haze that rose from the desert floor, the remaining emigrants were left to confront the implications of their reduced circumstances. They had lost not just a capable leader, but also the psychological comfort of his presence. The decision to banish him had been made democratically, but it left the party feeling smaller and more vulnerable than ever before. The landscape through which they traveled was beginning to change as they approached the Sierra Nevada. The flat expanses of the desert gave way to rolling hills covered with sagebrush and scattered pine trees.
The air grew cooler, particularly at night, and the emigrants began to notice the first signs of the approaching winter. Morning frost appeared on their blankets, and the mountains ahead seemed to grow more imposing with each passing day. The Truckee River, which they reached in early October, provided a corridor through the foothills that seemed to offer hope for an easy passage to the higher elevations. The valley was beautiful, with clear water flowing over granite boulders and tall pines casting shadows across meadows that still held the last green grass of the season. But the beauty was deceptive. The valley was also a trap, narrowing as it climbed toward the high passes, with steep walls that would make retreat increasingly difficult. The party's pace had slowed considerably as they began the climb toward the Sierra Nevada. The oxen, weakened by the desert crossing and the inadequate forage along the Humboldt River, struggled to pull their loads up the increasingly steep grades. The emigrants were forced to double-team the steepest sections, using multiple yokes of oxen to pull a single wagon while the others waited their turn. Progress was measured in miles per day, then in miles per several days, as the elevation gained came at an enormous cost in time and energy. The first snow fell on October 12th, just a light dusting that melted quickly in the morning sun, but served as an ominous warning of what to come. The emigrants had experienced snow before, of course, but not at this elevation and not with winter still weeks away, according to their calculations. The sight of white flakes settling on the pine boughs above them created a sense of foreboding that was difficult to shake.
Stanton, one of the single men traveling with the party, had volunteered to ride ahead to Sutter's Fort in the Sacramento Valley to bring back supplies and information about the route ahead. His departure left the party even smaller, but the promise of his return with help provided a psychological boost that helped maintain morale. The emigrants clung to the hope that relief was coming, even as their situation grew more precarious with each passing day. The ascent toward Truckee Lake, which would later be renamed Donner Lake, began in earnest during the third week of October. The trail, such as it was, followed the rushing waters of the Truckee River as it carved its way through granite canyons and pine forests. The scenery was spectacular. Towering peaks reflected in still pools, waterfalls cascading down rocky cliffs, and meadows where the last wildflowers of the season bloomed among the increasingly yellow aspen groves. But the beauty of the Sierra Nevada was matched by its danger. The granite formations that created such stunning vistas also made travel treacherous, with narrow ledges where a single mistake could send a wagon tumbling into the canyon below. The river crossings became increasingly difficult as the stream grew smaller and more turbulent, and the grade of the trail became so steep that the oxen had to rest frequently to catch their breath in the thin mountain air. The social dynamics of the party continued to evolve under the stress of the difficult ascent. The Donner families, traveling with the heaviest wagons and the most cumbersome loads, began to fall behind the main group. George Donner, despite his age and the burden of leadership, insisted on maintaining his optimistic demeanor, but his private conversations with his brother Jacob revealed growing concern about their ability to reach the pass before winter set in. The Breen families, with their strong Catholic faith and their experience with hardship, had emerged as one of the most resilient groups within the party.
Patrick Breen's steady leadership and his wife Peggy's practical skills had earned them respect from the other emigrants, and their wagon became a center of stability in the increasingly chaotic situation. The rhythm of their daily prayers provided a sense of continuity and hope that was desperately needed. The weather began to change more dramatically as they climbed higher into the mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably each day, and the morning frost began to linger longer into the day. The emigrants were forced to dig into their winter clothing supplies earlier than anticipated, and the women spent long hours each evening mending garments that had been damaged by the rough travel. The children, who had initially found the mountain scenery exciting, began to complain of the cold and the difficulty of the climb. On October 19th, Stanton returned from Sutter's Fort with 2 Miwok guides and a small pack train loaded with supplies. His arrival was greeted with joy and relief by the emigrants, who had begun to fear that they had been forgotten. The supplies he brought, flour, jerked beef, and other essentials, were not enough to sustain the party indefinitely, but they provided a crucial psychological boost at a time when morale was dangerously low. Stanton's report on the route ahead was mixed. The pass was still open, he reported, but snow was beginning to accumulate at the higher elevations. The window of opportunity for crossing the Sierra Nevada was closing rapidly, and the party would need to move with unprecedented speed to reach safety before winter made the passage impossible. The news galvanized the emigrants into action, and they began to push forward with renewed determination.
The final approach to Truckee Lake began on October 28th, with the party strung out along several miles of increasingly difficult trail. The lake itself, nestled in a granite basin surrounded by towering peaks, was beautiful in the autumn light, its clear waters reflecting the snow-dusted summits above. But the beauty was overshadowed by the ominous presence of the pass that rose beyond the lake, a narrow notch in the mountains that represented their only hope of reaching California. The Donner families, still struggling with their heavy wagons and weakened animals, were now more than a day behind the main party. George Donner had made the difficult decision to cache some of their supplies at Alder Creek, several miles below the lake, in an effort to lighten their loads and catch up with the others. The separation was intended to be temporary, but it would prove to be a fatal mistake. As the emigrants made camp on the shores of Truckee Lake on the evening of October 28th, they could see their immediate goal clearly before them. The pass, less than a mile away, seemed almost within reach. But the snow that had been falling intermittently all day began to increase in intensity, and the wind that whistled down from the peaks carried with it the promise of a storm that would change everything. The night brought the first heavy snowfall of the season, and by morning the pass was blocked by drifts that made travel impossible. The emigrants woke to find themselves trapped in a granite basin, with walls too steep to climb and a single exit that was now sealed by snow. The Sierra Nevada, which had seemed so beautiful and welcoming just days before, had become their prison. The realization of their situation settled over the party like a heavy blanket. They were trapped at an elevation of over 6,000 feet, with winter supplies that were already inadequate and no prospect of immediate rescue. The decisions they had made during the previous months
To take the cut-off, to delay in the desert, to maintain their heavy loads had led inexorably to this moment of crisis. The practical challenges of their situation were immediate and overwhelming. They needed shelter that could withstand the winter, food that would sustain them for an unknown period, and some means of signaling for help from the outside world. The women began to organize the remaining supplies, while the men started construction of crude shelters using materials salvaged from their wagons and whatever timber they could find in the immediate vicinity. The psychological impact of their entrapment was perhaps even more challenging than the practical problems. The emigrants had to confront the reality that they were no longer travelers passing through the wilderness, but castaways stranded in one of the most hostile environments on the continent. The mental adjustment from movement to stasis, from hope to endurance, would prove to be one of the most difficult aspects of their ordeal. The children, who had been the source of much joy and hope during the early part of the journey, now represented both the greatest motivation for survival and the most heartbreaking burden. The parents watched their children's faces grow thinner and their energy diminish, and the sight was more painful than their own suffering. The rhythm of family life, which had provided structure and comfort during the journey, began to break down under the stress of their desperate circumstances.
As the first week of November passed, the full scope of their situation became clear. They were trapped for the winter in a location that offered minimal resources, with supplies that would not sustain them until spring, and no certainty that help would arrive in time. The Sierra Nevada had claimed another group of travelers, and the emigrants of the Donner Party were about to discover what it truly meant to survive in the wilderness. The lake that had seemed so beautiful upon their arrival now appeared cold and forbidding, its dark waters reflecting the gray sky and the snow-covered peaks that rose around them like the walls of a fortress. The silence of the mountains was broken only by the wind in the pines and the occasional sound of an axe as the men worked to build shelters that would have to protect them from the worst winter weather the Sierra Nevada could deliver. The transformation from travelers to survivors was complete, and the most difficult chapter of their ordeal was about to begin. The decisions they would make in the coming days and weeks would determine who would see California and who would remain forever in the mountains, their bones scattered among the granite boulders and pine needles of the Sierra Nevada. The morning of October 29th revealed the full scope of their predicament. The snow that had fallen during the night was not the light dusting they had experienced before, but a heavy, wet accumulation that clung to every surface and transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. The pass, which had seemed so close the evening before, was now invisible beneath a blanket of white that stretched unbroken toward the peaks above. The emigrants' first instinct was to attempt the crossing despite the snow. A group of the strongest men, led by Stanton and including several of the teamsters, set out toward the pass with the two Miwok guides who had accompanied Stanton back from Sutter's Fort. The Indian guides, whose knowledge of the mountains was invaluable, shook their heads as they examined the conditions, but they agreed to make the attempt. The snow proved deeper than it appeared from a distance.
What had looked like a manageable accumulation from the shores of the lake turned out to be drifts that reached the men's waists in some places, and the loose, powdery consistency made each step an exhausting effort. The oxen, already weakened by the long journey and the inadequate forage of recent weeks, floundered helplessly in the deep snow, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the cold air as they struggled to find footing. By midday, it was clear that the crossing would be impossible with the wagons and livestock. The men returned to the lake camp, exhausted and demoralized, their clothes soaked through and their faces bearing the drawn expression of men who had seen their last hope disappear into the white wilderness above them. The Miwok guides, whose people had lived in these mountains for generations, spoke quietly with Stanton about the prospects for the winter ahead, and their words carried little comfort. The reality of their situation began to settle over the party like the snow itself, gradually but inexorably. They were trapped at an elevation where winter would be harsh and prolonged, with supplies that were already inadequate, and no prospect of immediate rescue. The nearest settlement was Sutter's Fort, more than 100 miles away, across terrain that would be impassable until spring. They would have to survive on their own resources until the snow melted enough to allow either escape or rescue.
The practical challenges of their situation were immediate and overwhelming. The wagons that had been their homes for months would have to be abandoned or dismantled for building materials. The canvas covers that had protected them from sun and rain were now needed for shelter construction, and the wagon boxes themselves could be converted into the foundations for crude cabins. Every piece of metal, every board, every rope would have to be carefully evaluated for its potential usefulness in the struggle ahead. The location of their camp, while beautiful, was far from ideal for long-term survival. The shores of Truckee Lake offered some protection from the wind, but the elevation meant that temperatures would remain below freezing for most of the winter. The surrounding forest provided timber for construction and fuel, but the trees were mostly pine and fir, which would burn quickly and provide little lasting warmth. The lake itself would freeze solid, eliminating it as a source of fresh water, though the snow would provide an endless supply once they learned to melt it efficiently. The emigrants organized themselves into work groups, with the men focusing on construction of shelters, while the women took inventory of their remaining supplies and began the careful rationing that would be essential for survival. The children, sensing the gravity of their situation, despite their parents' attempts to maintain normalcy, became unusually quiet and clingy, their natural exuberance dampened by the anxiety that permeated the adult conversations. The first shelter to be completed was a crude lean-to built against a large granite boulder near the lake shore. The structure was simple but effective. Wagon boards formed the walls, canvas provided the roof, and pine boughs were laid on the ground for insulation. The interior was barely large enough for a single family, but it represented a crucial first step in their adaptation to their new circumstances. The Breen family, whose practical skills and strong leadership had served them well during the journey, took charge of the construction efforts. Patrick Breen's experience as a farmer had given him knowledge of basic carpentry,
and his wife Peggy's organizational abilities proved invaluable in coordinating the work of multiple families. Their 7 children, ranging from infant to teenager, provided additional labor and helped maintain morale through their resilient spirits. The Murphy family, consisting of widow Lavina Murphy and her children and grandchildren, faced particular challenges in the construction process. Without an adult male to provide leadership and physical labor, they were forced to rely on the assistance of other families and the limited capabilities of the older children. 13-year-old John Landrum Murphy, despite his youth, took on responsibilities that would have challenged an adult, helping to haul timber and assist with the construction work. The weather continued to deteriorate as the days passed, with additional snowfall adding to the accumulation and temperatures dropping well below freezing even during the day. The emigrants worked with increasing urgency, knowing that their survival depended on completing adequate shelter before the full fury of the Sierra Nevada winter was unleashed upon them. The sound of axes and saws echoed across the lake from dawn to dusk, interrupted only by the occasional crash of a falling tree or the shouted instructions of the work leaders. The construction of the second shelter began on November 2nd, using materials salvaged from the Reed family's abandoned palace wagon and supplemented by timber cut from the surrounding forest. This structure was slightly larger than the first, with room for 2 families, but the accommodations were still primitive by any civilized standard. The walls were single boards with gaps that would have to be chinked with mud and pine needles, and the roof was a patchwork of canvas and hides that would provide minimal protection from the elements.
The psychological challenges of their situation were perhaps even more difficult than the practical ones. The emigrants had to adjust their mental framework from that of travelers temporarily passing through the wilderness to that of residents who would have to endure months of isolation and hardship. The social structures that had governed their relationships during the journey began to break down under the stress of their desperate circumstances, and new hierarchies emerged based on practical skills and personal resilience rather than social status or financial resources. The children, who had been a source of joy and hope during the early part of the journey, now represented both the greatest motivation for survival and the most heartbreaking burden. The parents watched their children's faces grow thinner and their energy diminish, and the sight was more painful than their own suffering. The games and activities that had once occupied the children during rest stops were replaced by the simple struggle to stay warm and find enough to eat. The daily routine of the camp began to establish itself around the basic necessities of survival. The women took turns preparing meals from the carefully rationed supplies, while the men continued work on the shelters and ventured into the forest to gather firewood and hunt for game. The children helped with simple tasks like collecting pine needles for insulation and melting snow for water, their small hands growing red and chapped from the cold. The hunting proved to be more challenging than anticipated. The wildlife that might have provided fresh meat had either migrated to lower elevations or entered winter hibernation. The few deer and smaller animals that remained in the area were wary and difficult to approach, and the deep snow made tracking nearly impossible. The emigrants had to rely primarily on their stored provisions, which were already running dangerously low.
The first death occurred on November 8th, when an elderly teamster named Hardcoop, who had been traveling with the Keysburg family, simply failed to wake up one morning. The man had been weakening for several days, and his death was not entirely unexpected, but it served as a stark reminder of the fragility of their situation. The ground was already frozen too hard for burial, so the body was placed in a crude shelter constructed from rocks and logs to await the spring thaw. The death of Hardcoop marked a turning point in the psychology of the group. The abstract possibility of death had become a concrete reality, and the emigrants were forced to confront the fact that not all of them would survive the winter. The conversations around the evening fires became more subdued, and the occasional laughter that had punctuated their earlier hardships disappeared entirely. The Donner families, still camped several miles away at Alder Creek, were facing their own set of challenges. George Donner had injured his hand while working on their shelter, and the wound had become infected, leaving him unable to perform the physical labor that was essential for survival. His wife, Tamsin, now heavy with pregnancy, had to take on responsibilities that would have been difficult under normal circumstances and were nearly impossible in their current situation. The Alder Creek camp was even more primitive than the main camp at the lake. The Donners had managed to construct only a crude lean-to shelter, and their supplies were scattered and poorly organized. The separation from the main party, which had seemed a temporary inconvenience, was now revealed as a potentially fatal mistake. The distance was too great for easy communication or mutual assistance, and each group would have to survive primarily on its own resources. The psychological isolation of the Alder Creek camp was perhaps even more challenging than the physical hardships. The Donner families were cut off from the larger group dynamics that provided some comfort and support at the main camp, and they had to find their own ways to maintain morale and hope. The children, who had once played together with their cousins and friends, now had only each other for companionship in the small, dark shelter.
Back at the main camp, the emigrants were beginning to understand the full scope of the challenge they faced. The snow continued to fall intermittently, adding to the accumulation and making it clear that the pass would remain blocked for months. The temperature dropped steadily, and the lake began to freeze around the edges, creating a surface that would eventually become solid enough to walk on, but was currently too dangerous to trust. The third shelter was completed on November 15th, providing accommodation for the remaining families who had been sleeping in the open or in inadequate temporary structures. The building process had become more efficient as the emigrants learned to work with the available materials, but the shelters remained crude and uncomfortable. The walls were thin, the roofs leaked, and the floors were nothing more than pine boughs laid over the frozen ground. The food situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The careful rationing that had been implemented when they first became trapped was proving inadequate as the reality of a long winter confinement became clear. The emigrants were forced to reduce their daily rations even further, and the constant hunger began to affect their ability to work and think clearly. The children, who needed more calories relative to their body weight than adults, were particularly affected by the reduced food supply. The social dynamics of the group continued to evolve under the stress of their circumstances. Leaders emerged based on practical skills and personal resilience
rather than previous social status. Louis Keseberg, despite his sometimes abrasive personality, proved to be remarkably resourceful in finding ways to stretch their supplies and improve their living conditions. His knowledge of European survival techniques, gained during his youth in Germany, provided valuable insights that helped the group adapt to their circumstances. The weather patterns of the Sierra Nevada winter began to establish themselves with a rhythm that would become familiar to the trapped emigrants. Periods of heavy snowfall would be followed by brief, clear spells, during which the temperature would drop dramatically, but the brilliant sunshine would provide psychological relief. The contrast between the stunning beauty of the snow-covered peaks and the desperate circumstances of their situation created a surreal quality that some of the emigrants would later describe as dreamlike. The construction of the fourth and final shelter began on November 20th, using the last of the available materials salvaged from the abandoned wagons. This structure was the largest of the group, designed to accommodate the Murphy family and several of the single men who had been living in the most primitive conditions. The building process was hampered by the increasingly deep snow and the weakening condition of the workers, but the emigrants understood that adequate shelter was essential for their survival. The daily routine of the camp had settled into a pattern that revolved around the basic necessities of survival. The men would venture out each morning to gather firewood and hunt for game, while the women prepared meals from the carefully rationed supplies and tended to the children. The afternoon hours were typically spent on maintenance tasks, repairing damage to the shelters, organizing supplies, and preparing for the long, cold nights ahead. The evenings were the most difficult time, when the emigrants would gather around the small fires and try to maintain some semblance of normal social interaction. The conversations inevitably turned to their situation and the prospects for rescue, but the discussions were becoming increasingly strained as the reality of their circumstances became impossible to ignore. The children, who had once been a source of distraction and hope, now served as constant reminders of the stakes involved in their survival.
The psychological toll of their confinement was beginning to manifest in various ways. Some of the emigrants withdrew into themselves, becoming increasingly isolated and uncommunicative. Others became obsessed with planning and organizing, as if the act of making lists and schedules could somehow impose order on their chaotic circumstances. The stress of their situation was revealing personality traits that had been hidden during the easier parts of their journey, and the social fabric of the group was beginning to fray under the pressure. The first serious attempt at escape came on November 25th, when a group of 15 people, including several women and children, decided to try to cross the pass on foot. The group was led by Stanton, who felt responsible for getting the party to safety, and included some of the strongest and most determined members of the group. They prepared carefully, taking what food they could spare and improvising snowshoes from bent wood and leather strips. The escape attempt began with high hopes and determination, but the reality of travel in the deep snow quickly became apparent. The improvised snowshoes were inadequate for the conditions, and the group found themselves floundering in drifts that reached their waists. The cold was intense, and the physical exertion required to make progress through the snow was exhausting. By the end of the first day, they had covered less than a mile, and it was clear that the attempt would have to be abandoned. The failed escape attempt had a devastating effect on the morale of the entire group. The emigrants had pinned their hopes on the possibility that some of them might be able to reach civilization and bring back help, but the reality of their situation was now undeniable. They were trapped until spring, with no prospect of rescue and rapidly dwindling supplies. The psychological impact of this realization was almost as difficult to bear as the physical hardships they faced. The approach of winter in earnest brought with it a new set of challenges that the emigrants had not fully anticipated. The temperature dropped to levels that made it dangerous to venture outside for extended periods, and the snow continued to accumulate at a rate that threatened to bury their shelters entirely. The emigrants were forced to spend most of their time indoors in cramped conditions that tested their patience and sanity. The social tensions that had been building since their entrapment began to surface in more open conflicts. Arguments broke out over the distribution of food, the allocation of work assignments, and the decisions that had led to their current predicament. The democratic decision-making that had characterized their earlier journey was replaced by more authoritarian structures, as the urgency of survival took precedence over consensus and fairness. The children, who had been remarkably resilient during the early stages of their confinement, began to show signs of serious distress. Their growth was stunted by malnutrition, and their usual energy and playfulness were replaced by a listless acceptance of their circumstances. The parents watched their children's condition deteriorate with a mixture of guilt and helplessness, knowing that their own decisions had contributed to their family's plight. As November drew to a close, the emigrants of the Donner Party found themselves facing the full reality of their situation. They were trapped in one of the most hostile environments on the continent, with supplies that would not last through the winter, and no prospect of immediate rescue. The decisions they had made during the previous months had led inexorably to this moment of crisis, and the choices they would make in the coming weeks would determine who would survive to see California and who would remain forever in the mountains.
The lake that had seemed so beautiful upon their arrival now appeared cold and forbidding, its surface beginning to freeze in patterns that reflected the gray sky above. The silence of the mountains was broken only by the wind in the pines and the occasional sound of an axe as the emigrants continued their desperate efforts to prepare for the long winter ahead. The transformation from hopeful travelers to desperate survivors was complete, and the most difficult chapter of their ordeal was about to begin. The first week of December 1846 brought with it a silence that seemed to press against the very walls of the crude shelters scattered along the shores of Truckee Lake. It was not merely the absence of sound, but something deeper, a profound quiet that spoke of a world transformed by snow and cold into something alien and unforgiving. The emigrants who had once filled their evenings with conversation and planning now huddled around their small fires, conserving both fuel and words, as if speech itself had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The rhythm of their days had settled into a pattern that revolved entirely around the basic necessities of survival. Each morning brought the same routine. Someone would venture outside to assess the weather and gather snow for melting, while others would carefully measure out the day's rations from supplies that seemed to diminish with alarming speed. The sound of metal scraping against metal as they portioned out flour or cut paper-thin slices of remaining bacon had become as familiar as a heartbeat, marking time in a world where the sun's passage across the sky was often obscured by clouds and falling snow. Patrick Breen, The Irish immigrant whose steady faith had provided stability during the journey had taken to keeping a diary of their ordeal. His entries, scratched out by firelight, with fingers that grew increasingly stiff from the cold, captured the relentless nature of their situation with stark simplicity. December 1st, 1846, he wrote. Still snowing, wind northwest, snow about 5 or 6 feet deep. No living thing without wings can get about. The words carried the weight of a man watching his carefully ordered world dissolve into chaos, yet maintaining the discipline of documentation as if the act of recording their experience might somehow impose meaning on their suffering. The shelters themselves had become worlds unto themselves, each one a small universe where families learned to exist in spaces that would have been considered inadequate for storing tools back in their former lives. The Breen cabin, constructed from salvaged wagon parts and chinked with mud and pine needles, housed 8 people in a space barely 12 feet square. The walls, made of single boards with gaps that allowed the wind to whistle through, were covered with whatever cloth could be spared, blankets, clothing, even pieces of canvas that had once protected their possessions during the journey across the plains. The daily struggle for warmth consumed enormous amounts of energy and resources. Firewood, which had seemed abundant when they first arrived, was now revealed to be a precious commodity that required constant attention. The men would venture out into the deep snow each morning, often sinking to their waists as they made their way to the scattered pine trees that provided their fuel. The work of cutting and hauling wood was exhausting in their weakened condition, and the fuel they gathered seemed to disappear almost as quickly as they could burn it. The women had adapted to cooking over fires that were kept deliberately small to conserve fuel. Learning to make a thin soup from bones that had already been boiled multiple times became a skill that meant the difference between sustenance and starvation. The children, who had once complained about the simple fare of trail cooking, now waited with patient hunger for whatever could be prepared from their dwindling stores.
The psychological adaptation required to survive in such conditions was perhaps even more challenging than the physical hardships. The emigrants had to learn to live with hunger as a constant companion, to find comfort in spaces that would have seemed uninhabitable just months before, and to maintain hope in circumstances that seemed to offer little reason for optimism. The mental discipline required to ration not just food, but also worry, to conserve emotional energy as carefully as they conserved calories, became a survival skill that some mastered better than others. The social dynamics within the shelters evolved in ways that would have been unimaginable during the comfortable early days of their journey. Privacy became a luxury that no longer existed, and the emigrants learned to navigate the complex etiquette of shared survival. The sound of someone else's breathing, the rustle of movement in the darkness, the whispered conversations that carried clearly through the thin walls, all of these became part of the new normal, an intimacy born of necessity rather than choice. The children, who had shown remarkable resilience during the early stages of their confinement, began to exhibit signs of the profound stress they were experiencing. Their games became quieter and more subdued, often revolving around themes of food and warmth that reflected their constant preoccupations. The sight of their parents' growing anxiety was perhaps more disturbing to them than their own hunger,
and many of the youngest children began to display behaviors that suggested they understood, on some level, the gravity of their situation. The Murphy cabin, which housed the widow Lavina Murphy and her extended family, faced particular challenges due to the number of people crowded into the small space. With 13 people sharing quarters designed for perhaps half that number, the basic functions of daily life became complex logistical problems. The simple act of everyone lying down to sleep required careful choreography, and the preparation of meals became an exercise in coordination that tested everyone's patience and ingenuity. The weather patterns of the Sierra Nevada winter established themselves with a rhythm that became both familiar and dreaded. Periods of heavy snowfall would trap the emigrants in their shelters for days at a time, followed by brief clear spells that allowed them to venture outside to gather wood and assess their situation. The temperature during these clear periods would often drop to levels that made prolonged exposure dangerous, and the brilliant sunshine reflecting off the snow could cause temporary blindness for those who lacked adequate eye protection. The accumulation of snow around their shelters created a constantly changing landscape that required ongoing adaptation. The emigrants learned to dig tunnels to connect their cabins, creating a network of passages that allowed them to move between shelters without having to struggle through the deep drifts above ground. These tunnels, carved from snow that had been compressed by its own weight, became highways in their miniature world, allowing for the sharing of resources and the maintenance of social connections that were crucial for psychological survival. The hunting that had provided occasional fresh meat during the early weeks of their confinement became increasingly difficult as the winter deepened. The few deer and smaller animals that had remained in the area either migrated to lower elevations or became so wary that approaching them was almost impossible. The emigrants were forced to rely almost entirely on their stored provisions, which had been calculated for a journey, not a winter-long siege.
The first serious discussions about alternative sources of food began in mid-December, when it became clear that their current supplies would not sustain them until spring. The conversations were conducted in hushed tones, with careful euphemisms and indirect references, as if speaking plainly about their options might somehow make them more real. The emigrants found themselves contemplating actions that would have been unthinkable during their former lives, measuring the unthinkable against the certainty of starvation. The deaths that had begun with the elderly teamster Hardcup continued as the weakest members of the party succumbed to the combination of cold, hunger, and despair. Each death was both a tragedy and a grim reminder of what awaited them all if rescue did not come soon. The bodies, frozen solid in the bitter cold, were placed in crude shelters constructed from rocks and logs, awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for proper burial. The accumulation of these makeshift morgues around their camp served as a constant reminder of the fragility of their situation. The Donner families, still isolated at their Alder Creek camp several miles away, faced their own unique set of challenges. George Donner's hand wound had become severely infected, leaving him unable to perform the physical labor necessary for survival.
His wife, Tamsin Donna, now in the advanced stages of pregnancy, had to take on responsibilities that would have been difficult under the best of circumstances and were nearly impossible in their current situation. The smaller group at Alder Creek was even more isolated than the main camp, with fewer people to share the work and the psychological burden of their confinement. The birth of Tamsin Donna's child in the crude shelter at Alder Creek represented both a moment of joy and a source of additional anxiety in their desperate circumstances. The infant, born into a world of hunger and cold, became a symbol of both hope and vulnerability. The practical challenges of caring for a newborn in such conditions, keeping the child warm, finding adequate nutrition for a nursing mother, maintaining the hygiene necessary for health, required resources and energy that the family could barely spare. The psychological toll of their confinement was beginning to manifest in ways that went beyond simple hunger and cold. Some of the emigrants began to exhibit signs of what would later be understood as depression and anxiety, withdrawing from social interaction and losing interest in the basic activities of survival. The stress of their situation was revealing personality traits that had been hidden during the easier parts of their journey, and the social fabric of the group was beginning to fray under the pressure. The holiday season, which should have been a time of celebration and hope, passed almost unnoticed in the struggle for survival. Christmas Day 1846 was marked only by a slightly larger portion of their carefully rationed food and a brief attempt at maintaining some semblance of normal family traditions. The children, who had been counting the days until Christmas during the early part of their journey, now seemed to have forgotten the significance of the date, their attention entirely focused on the immediate needs of warmth and food. The new year arrived without ceremony or celebration, marked only by Patrick Breen's diary entry. January 1st, 1847. We pray the God of mercy to deliver us from our present calamity, if it be His holy will. The words carried the weight of a man who had seen his faith tested in ways he could never have imagined, yet still maintained the discipline of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
The second serious attempt at escape came in mid-January, when a group of 10 people, including several women, decided to try once again to cross the pass on foot. This group, which would later be known as the Forlorn Hope, was led by Stanton and included some of the strongest and most determined members of the party. They prepared more carefully than the previous group, taking what food they could spare and constructing better snowshoes from bent wood and leather strips salvaged from their remaining equipment. The departure of the Forlorn Hope was both a moment of optimism and a source of additional anxiety for those who remained behind. The emigrants understood that this might be their last realistic chance of getting word to the outside world before spring, but they also knew that the group faced almost impossible odds. The sight of their friends and family members disappearing into the white wilderness was both hopeful and heartbreaking, a reminder of how desperate their situation had become. The daily routine of the camp had to be reorganized around the reduced number of people available for the essential tasks of survival. The men who remained were forced to take on additional responsibilities for gathering firewood and maintaining the shelters, while the women had to manage the increasingly complex task of rationing food among a smaller group. The children, who had once been able to play and explore under the watchful eyes of multiple adults, now found themselves with fewer supervisors and more responsibilities.
The weather during the third week of January brought a series of storms that trapped the emigrants in their shelters for days at a time. The wind howled across the lake with an intensity that made the walls of their crude cabins shake, while the snow fell so heavily that it was impossible to see more than a few feet outside their doors. The sound of the storm was constant and overwhelming, a reminder of the power of the forces arrayed against them and the fragility of their shelter. The psychological impact of these storms was perhaps even more difficult to bear than the physical discomfort. The emigrants were forced to remain in their cramped quarters for extended periods, with nothing to do but listen to the wind and worry about their dwindling supplies. The enforced inactivity was maddening for people who had been accustomed to the constant movement and activity of the trail, and the close quarters began to test even the strongest family bonds. The food situation, which had been critical for weeks, reached a point of genuine crisis by the end of January. The emigrants were forced to reduce their daily rations to levels that provided barely enough calories to sustain life, and the effects of prolonged malnutrition were becoming visible in their appearance and behavior. The children, who had once been plump and energetic, now appeared gaunt and listless, their eyes too large for their thinning faces, and their movements slow and deliberate. The discussions about alternative sources of food, which had begun as whispered conversations in the darkest corners of the shelters, now became more open and urgent. The emigrants found themselves facing choices that challenged the very foundations of their moral and cultural beliefs, measuring the unthinkable against the certainty of death. The conversations were conducted with careful euphemisms and indirect references, as if speaking plainly about their options might somehow make them more real or more acceptable.
The first instance of what would later be called cannibalism occurred sometime in late January, though the exact date and circumstances were carefully obscured by those who survived to tell the story. The decision was not made lightly or without profound moral struggle, but rather represented the final breakdown of the social and cultural barriers that had governed their behavior during their former lives. The emigrants understood that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but they also understood that the alternative was death. The psychological impact of this decision on those who made it was profound and lasting. The emigrants who participated in this ultimate act of survival found themselves forever changed, carrying with them a burden of guilt and shame that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The social dynamics of the group were also fundamentally altered, as the shared experience of moral transgression created new bonds of understanding and mutual dependence. The practical aspects of their new reality were managed with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized their earlier survival efforts. The emigrants developed routines and procedures that allowed them to obtain the nutrition they needed while maintaining some semblance of dignity and humanity. The process was conducted with as much reverence and respect as possible, though the reality of their situation made it impossible to maintain the ceremonial aspects of their former relationship with mortality. The children, who had been carefully shielded from the full reality of their situation, began to understand that something fundamental had changed in their world. Their parents' behavior became more secretive and strained, and the food they were given, while more nutritious than anything they had tasted in weeks, came without explanation or discussion. The younger children accepted the change with the adaptability of youth, while the older ones began to ask questions that their parents found difficult to answer.
The weather during the first week of February brought a brief respite from the constant storms, allowing the emigrants to venture outside and assess their situation. The snow had accumulated to depths that made movement extremely difficult, and the shelters were nearly buried beneath drifts that had been sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The lake itself was frozen solid, creating a flat expanse of white that reflected the pale winter sun with blinding intensity. The psychological relief of being able to move freely outside their shelters was immense, even though the cold made prolonged exposure dangerous. The emigrants spent precious energy digging out their buried possessions and reorganizing their living spaces, activities that served no immediate survival purpose but provided the mental stimulation and sense of accomplishment that were crucial for maintaining morale. The simple act of standing upright in an open space after weeks of confinement in cramped quarters was a luxury that reminded them of what they had lost and what they hoped to regain. The hunting during this clear period proved more successful than it had been in weeks, with several of the men managing to trap small animals that had been driven to hunger to venture closer to the camp. The fresh meat, though it amounted to only a few pounds when divided among the survivors, provided not just nutrition, but also a psychological boost that was perhaps even more valuable. The taste of fresh game reminded them of their former lives and provided hope that they might yet survive to see spring.
The news of the outside world, which had been entirely absent during their confinement, began to seem like something from a distant dream. The emigrants could only imagine what was happening beyond the mountains, and their speculation about the progress of the war with Mexico, the fate of friends and family members, and the development of California society took on an almost mythical quality. The world they had left behind seemed to belong to a different lifetime, inhabited by people who had never known the extremes of hunger and cold that had become their daily reality. The maintenance of their equipment and shelters required constant attention as the harsh conditions took their toll on materials that had never been designed for such extreme use. The emigrants learned to become skilled at improvised repairs, using materials in ways that would have been unthinkable during their former lives. A piece of leather from a worn-out boot might become a crucial component in a shoe, while a broken wagon wheel could be dismantled to provide wood for shelter repair. The social relations within the camp had evolved in ways that reflected their new reality. The formal hierarchies that had existed during their journey, based on social status, financial resources, and family connections, had been replaced by more practical arrangements based on survival skills and mutual dependence. The ability to find food, maintain equipment, or provide emotional support became the new measures of value, and the emigrants learned to appreciate qualities in their companions that they had never noticed during their former lives. The psychological strategies that individuals developed to cope with their situation varied widely, reflecting the different ways that human beings adapt to extreme stress. Some of the emigrants found comfort in maintaining routines and rituals from their former lives, even when these activities served no practical purpose. Others focused entirely on the immediate requirements of survival, abandoning any activity that did not directly contribute to their physical well-being. The most successful survivors seemed to be those who could balance both approaches, maintaining enough connection to their former selves to preserve their sanity while adapting completely to the demands of their new reality.
The religious faith that had provided comfort and structure for many of the emigrants during their journey was tested in ways that challenged the very foundations of their beliefs. The questions raised by their extreme circumstances about the nature of divine providence, the meaning of suffering, and the moral implications of their survival choices could not be answered by the simple faith that had sustained them during easier times. Some of the emigrants found their faith strengthened by their trials, while others discovered that their beliefs were inadequate to explain or comfort them in their current situation. The children's adaptation to their circumstances was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their survival. The youngest members of the party, who had initially been the most vulnerable and dependent, often showed greater resilience and adaptability than their elders. Their natural acceptance of change and their ability to find joy in small pleasures provided a source of hope and motivation for the adults who were responsible for their care. The sight of children playing games or finding wonder in the beauty of the snow-covered landscape reminded the adults of what they were fighting to preserve. The dreams and aspirations that had motivated the emigrants to begin their journey seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The visions of fertile California valleys, profitable businesses, and comfortable homes had been replaced by the simple goal of surviving until spring. The complexity of their former desires for social advancement, material prosperity, and personal fulfillment had been reduced to the basic necessities of food, warmth, and shelter. The simplification was both liberating and terrifying, stripping away the illusions and pretensions that had previously defined their lives.
The approach of spring, though still weeks away, began to manifest itself in subtle changes that provided hope for the survivors. The days grew slightly longer, though the difference was barely perceptible, and the quality of light began to change in ways that suggested the eventual return of warmth. The emigrants learnt to read these signs with the intensity of people whose lives depended on understanding the rhythm of the seasons. And every small indication of change was discussed and analyzed with the attention that had once been devoted to stock prices or social gossip. The second rescue attempt, organized by the survivors of the Forlorn Hope who had somehow managed to reach California, represented the first concrete hope the emigrants had experienced in months. The news that help was on the way, brought by Native American messengers who had been hired by the rescue party, created a surge of optimism that was almost overwhelming after the prolonged despair of their confinement. The knowledge that they had not been forgotten, that people in the outside world were working to save them, provided a psychological boost that was perhaps as important as any physical assistance. The preparation for rescue required a different kind of survival skill that the emigrants had been developing during their confinement. They had to decide what possessions to abandon, which family members were strong enough to travel, and how to present themselves to the rescuers in a way that would ensure continued assistance. The decisions were complex and emotionally charged, requiring the emigrants to confront the reality of how much they had lost and how little they had become. The sight of the first rescue party, appearing through the snow like figures from a dream, represented both salvation and a kind of judgment. The rescuers, healthy and well-fed, served as a reminder of what the emigrants had once been and what they hoped to become again. The contrast between the two groups, one representing the civilized world of adequate food and comfortable shelter, the other representing the extremes of human endurance and moral compromise, created a tension that would color all their subsequent interactions.
The process of evacuation would prove to be almost as challenging as the survival itself, requiring the emigrants to summon reserves of strength and courage they had not known they possessed. The journey back to civilization would be long and dangerous, and not all of those who had survived the winter would live to see California. The mountain that had been their prison would exact a final toll before releasing them to the world they had left behind so many months before. The story of the Donner Party's winter at Truckee Lake would become one of the most famous survival stories in American history. But for those who lived through it, the experience was less about heroism than about the fundamental human capacity to endure the unendurable. The emigrants had discovered both the best and worst of human nature in themselves and their companions, and the knowledge would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The snow that had trapped them in the mountains had also transformed them, creating survivors who would never again take for granted the simple pleasures of warmth, food, and safety that had once defined their daily existence. The Sierra Nevada, indifferent to human suffering and human courage alike, would continue to guard its secrets long after the last of the Donner Party had departed. The lake would return to its ancient rhythm of seasons, the snow would melt and fall again, and the mountains would stand as they had for millennia, beautiful and terrible in their eternal silence. But the story of what human beings could endure and what they might become under extreme pressure would echo through American consciousness for generations to come, a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit.
The morning of February 18, 1847, dawned with a peculiar clarity that sometimes follows the passage of a winter storm, the air so crisp and thin that it seemed to magnify every sound and sharpen every detail of the snow-covered landscape. The emigrants at Truckee Lake, who had learned to measure time not by clocks but by the rhythm of their own survival, had no way of knowing that this day would mark the beginning of their deliverance. The same sun that had witnessed their suffering for so many months now illuminated the approach of 7 men on improvised snowshoes, their figures dark against the white expanse as they made their way across the frozen lake. The rescue party, led by Aquila Glover and organized by the survivors of the Forlorn Hope who had somehow managed to reach California, carried with them more than just the physical supplies needed for survival. They brought proof that the outside world still existed, that civilization continued beyond the mountain barriers, and that the emigrants had not been forgotten in their wilderness prison. The sight of these healthy, well-fed men emerging from the forest like apparitions was almost too overwhelming to process for people who had grown accustomed to seeing only the gaunt faces of their fellow survivors. The initial moments of contact between the rescuers and the rescued were marked with a complex mixture of emotions that neither group had been prepared to navigate. The rescue party, despite their determination to help, could not entirely conceal their shock at the condition of the emigrants they had come to save. The hollow-eyed figures who emerged from the crude shelters bore little resemblance to the prosperous families who had departed Missouri less than a year before. The rescuers found themselves face to face with people who had been transformed by their ordeal into something that challenged their understanding of human endurance and human nature. The emigrants, for their part, struggled to process the reality of their salvation.
After months of focusing entirely on the immediate requirements of survival, the sudden appearance of rescue seemed almost dreamlike, too good to be true. The careful emotional discipline they had developed to cope with their situation made it difficult to fully embrace the hope that rescue represented. They had learned to protect themselves from disappointment by expecting nothing, and the presence of the rescue party required them to risk believing in the possibility of a future beyond their mountain prison. The practical challenges of organizing the evacuation were immense, requiring decisions that would determine who lived and who died among the survivors. The rescue party had brought limited supplies and could only support a certain number of people on the treacherous journey back to civilization. The emigrants were forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable during their former lives, deciding which family members were strong enough to travel, which possessions could be abandoned, and how to present themselves to their rescuers in a way that would ensure continued assistance. The selection process for the first group of evacuees was conducted with the cold logic of survival, but the emotional impact on those who made these decisions was profound. Parents had to choose between children. Spouses had to decide whether to travel together or separately, and the elderly had to confront the reality that their chances of survival were minimal. The bonds of family and friendship that had sustained the emigrants through their ordeal were tested in new ways as the community that had been forged by shared suffering began to dissolve in the face of individual survival needs. The children, who had shown remarkable resilience during the darkest days of their confinement, now faced the additional trauma of separation from family members and the uncertainty of travel in conditions that remained extremely dangerous. The youngest members of the party, who had adapted to their circumstances with the flexibility of youth, now had to summon the strength for a journey that would challenge even the healthiest adults. The sight of children who had been reduced to skeletal thinness attempting to walk through deep snow was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the human capacity to endure beyond all reasonable expectations. The first evacuation group, consisting of 23 people, including several children, departed from Truckee Lake on February 22, 1847, leaving behind 13 survivors who would have to wait for a second rescue attempt. The parting was conducted with the careful restraint that had characterized so many of their interactions during the winter, but the underlying emotion was overwhelming. Those who left carried with them the guilt of abandoning their companions, while those who remained faced the possibility that they might never see their loved ones again. The journey back to civilization proved to be almost as challenging as the survival itself had been. The rescue party had to navigate treacherous mountain passes while supporting evacuees who were weakened by months of malnutrition and exposure. The emigrants who had survived the winter at Truckee Lake now faced the additional trial of travel in conditions that would have been difficult for healthy individuals. The irony of their situation, that rescue itself might prove fatal, was not lost on those who had already endured so much. The weather during the evacuation was unpredictable and often dangerous, with sudden storms that could trap the rescue party in the open without adequate shelter. The emigrants learned that their ordeal was not yet over, that the mountain would exact a final toll before releasing them to the world they had left behind. The deaths that occurred during the evacuation added a bitter note to what should have been a story of triumph, reminding everyone involved that survival was never guaranteed, even with help at hand. The second rescue party, organized by James Reed, who had been banished from the wagon train months earlier, arrived at Truckee Lake on March 1, 1847, to find conditions that had deteriorated even further during the absence of the first evacuation group. The remaining survivors, weakened by additional weeks of starvation and exposure, were in even worse condition than their departed companions had been. The shelters that had provided minimal protection during the winter were now falling apart, and the survivors were barely clinging to life. The reunion between James Reed and his wife and children was emotionally overwhelming, representing both personal redemption and the continuation of family bonds that had been tested by separation and suffering. Reed, who was consumed by guilt over his banishment and the fate of his family, found himself face to face with the consequences of decisions made months earlier. The sight of his wife and children, reduced to near skeletal condition but still alive, was both a source of joy and a reminder of how close they had come to complete disaster. The Donner families at Alder Creek presented particular challenges for the rescue efforts. George Donner, whose infected hand had made him increasingly helpless during the winter, was now too weak to travel. His wife, Tamsin, who had given birth during the winter and was caring for both her newborn and her husband, faced the impossible choice between staying with her dying husband and evacuating with her children. The decision she ultimately made to send her children to safety while remaining behind to care for her husband represented the kind of moral courage that had characterized many of the emigrants' choices during their ordeal.
The third rescue attempt, led by William Eddy, who had been one of the survivors of the Forlorn Hope, encountered conditions that had become truly desperate. The remaining survivors at both camps were on the verge of death, and the evidence of the extremes to which they had been driven was impossible to ignore. The rescuers found themselves confronting not just physical suffering, but the moral complexity of what people had done to survive, and the judgments they formed would influence how the story of the Donner Party was told for generations to come. The final evacuations took place under conditions that tested everyone involved to their limits. The survivors who had endured the entire winter were in the worst possible condition for travel, while the rescuers were exhausted by repeated trips into the mountains. The logistics of moving people who could barely walk through deep snow and treacherous terrain required heroic efforts from everyone involved. The success of these final rescue attempts was due as much to determination and courage as to practical planning and resources. The death of George Donner during the final rescue attempt marked the end of one of the most tragic personal stories within the larger tragedy of the Donner Party. His leadership during the early stages of the journey had been crucial to the emigrants' initial success, but his injury and subsequent infection had made him increasingly helpless as their situation deteriorated. His death, alone in the mountains, except for his devoted wife, represented the ultimate sacrifice that the Sierra Nevada had demanded from the emigrants who had dared to challenge its barriers. The fate of Tamsin Donner, who chose to remain with her dying husband rather than evacuate with her children, became one of the most poignant aspects of the entire story. Her decision to stay behind represented the kind of moral choice that defined the emigrants' experience.
the conflict between personal survival and duty to others. Her death, which occurred sometime after the final rescue attempt, was both a tragedy and a testament to the strength of human bonds that even extreme suffering could not break. The survivors who finally reached California found themselves in a world that was both familiar and utterly foreign. The simple pleasures of adequate food, warm shelter, and clean clothing were almost overwhelming after months of deprivation. The emigrants who had learned to measure success by their ability to survive another day now had to readjust to a world where such basic needs were taken for granted. The transition from survival mode to normal life proved to be more difficult than many had anticipated. The physical recovery of the survivors was complicated by the long-term effects of their ordeal. Months of malnutrition and exposure had left permanent damage that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. The children who survived showed remarkable resilience, but the adults carried physical scars that served as constant reminders of their experience. The process of healing was gradual and incomplete, and many of the survivors would never fully recover from the trauma they had endured. The social reintegration of the Donner Party survivors was perhaps even more challenging than their physical recovery. The story of their ordeal, with its implications of cannibalism and moral compromise, created a stigma that followed them wherever they went. The survivors found themselves objects of both fascination and revulsion, their experience serving as a source of entertainment for some and moral instruction for others. The complexity of their story, which involved both heroic endurance and disturbing moral choices, made it difficult for outsiders to understand or categorize.
The legal and financial consequences of their ordeal added additional burdens to the survivors' attempts to rebuild their lives. The property they had abandoned in the mountains represented significant losses, and the debts they had incurred during their journey remained to be paid. The emigrants who had set out for California with dreams of prosperity found themselves starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the traumatic memories of their experience. The psychological impact of their ordeal would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The memories of hunger, cold, and moral compromise could not be easily forgotten or overcome. Many of the survivors suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, depression, and anxiety that made it difficult to function in normal society. The coping mechanisms they had developed during their survival were not easily abandoned, and many found it difficult to trust in the security of their new circumstances. The children who survived the ordeal were affected in ways that would influence their entire lives. The youngest members of the party, who had no clear memory of life before the mountains, had to learn how to live in a world where food was abundant and shelter was secure. The older children, who remembered their former lives, struggled to reconcile their memories of comfort and security with the reality of what they had endured. The psychological development of these children was forever altered by their experience, and many would carry the effects of their trauma into adulthood. The story of the Donner Party began to take on a life of its own almost immediately after the rescue, as newspapers and popular writers seized on the dramatic elements of their experience. The survivors found themselves thrust into the public eye,
their private tragedy becoming a source of public fascination. The telling and retelling of their story often emphasized the most sensational aspects of their experience, while the complex reality of their choices and their suffering was simplified for public consumption. The moral judgments that were passed on the survivors reflected the values and prejudices of their time, but also revealed the difficulty that people had in understanding the extremes of human experience. The emigrants who had been forced to make choices between survival and moral principle found themselves criticized by people who had never faced such decisions. The complexity of their situation, which involved both admirable courage and disturbing necessity, was often lost in the rush to categorize their actions as either heroic or deplorable. The survivors themselves struggled with the moral implications of their experience, carrying guilt and shame that would never fully heal. The choices they had made during their ordeal continued to haunt them, and the knowledge of what they had done to survive created a burden that was almost as heavy as the physical suffering they had endured. The process of coming to terms with their actions was lifelong, and many of the survivors would never fully forgive themselves for the extremes to which they had been driven. The geographical legacy of the Donner Party's ordeal was inscribed on the landscape itself, as the lake where they had been trapped was renamed Truckee Lake and later became known as Donner Lake. The physical remnants of their shelters and the artifacts they had left behind became objects of fascination for later visitors to the area. The mountain pass they had failed to cross before the snows came was named Donner Pass, ensuring that their story would be remembered by every traveler who followed their route.
The historical significance of the Donner Party's experience extended beyond their individual tragedy to become a symbol of the dangers and difficulties of westward expansion. Their story served as a cautionary tale about the risks of pioneering travel, but also as a testament to human endurance and the will to survive. The emigrants who had set out with such hope and determination had encountered the most extreme challenges that the frontier could offer, and their response to those challenges revealed both the best and worst of human nature. The influence of their story on American culture was immediate and lasting, inspiring countless retellings in literature, film, and popular culture. The dramatic elements of their experience, the isolation, the desperate choices, the moral ambiguity, provided material for writers and artists who sought to explore the darker aspects of the American frontier experience. The Donner Party became a touchstone for discussions about survival, morality, and the costs of progress. The scientific interest in their story contributed to the development of new understanding about survival physiology and the effects of extreme stress on human behavior. The detailed records kept by some of the survivors provided valuable information about the progression of starvation and the psychological adaptations required for survival in extreme conditions. The medical examination of the survivors after their rescue contributed to knowledge about the long-term effects of malnutrition and exposure. The families of the survivors carried the burden of their ancestors' experience for generations, as the story of the Donner Party became part of their family history.
The descendants of the emigrants found themselves defined by an experience they had never shared, carrying both pride in their ancestors' survival and shame about the means by which it had been achieved. The complexity of their inheritance, which included both heroic endurance and disturbing necessity, made it difficult for later generations to fully understand or embrace their family's history. The Sierra Nevada, indifferent to human ambition and human suffering alike, continued to present challenges to travelers long after the Donner Party's ordeal had ended. The railroad that would eventually cross the mountains followed a route that passed near the site of their winter camp, and the engineers who built it were forced to contend with the same geographical obstacles that had trapped the emigrants. The mountain's ultimate conquest by technology did not diminish the significance of what the Donner Party had endured, but rather highlighted the magnitude of the challenges they had faced with only primitive tools and human determination.
The seasons continued their ancient cycle at Truckee Lake, the snow falling and melting according to patterns that had been established long before humans first entered the region. The lake itself returned to its natural rhythm, the ice forming and breaking according to the demands of climate and weather. The shelters that had provided minimal protection during the winter of 1846-47 gradually deteriorated and disappeared, leaving only traces that would be discovered by archaeologists generations later. The story of the Donner Party's 87 days of desperation in the Sierra Nevada had become part of the larger narrative of American expansion, a reminder of the costs that had been paid for the settlement of the West. The emigrants who had set out with such hope and determination had encountered the most extreme challenges that the frontier could offer, and their response to those challenges had revealed the full range of human capacity for both survival and moral compromise. Their experience had become a permanent part of American consciousness, a story that would continue to fascinate and disturb readers for generations to come. The mountain that had been their prison and their testing ground stood unchanged, its peaks still crowned with snow that seemed to never melt, its valleys still offering both beauty and danger to those who entered them. The Sierra Nevada had witnessed their struggle and their suffering, their courage and their desperation, and had remained unmoved by their human drama. The emigrants who had challenged its barriers had been forever changed by the encounter, but the mountain itself continued its ancient existence, indifferent to the human stories that played out in its shadow. The legacy of their experience would endure long after the last of the survivors had died, a reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the extremes to which people might be driven when that civilization was stripped away. The story of the Donner Party had become more than just a tale of survival. It had become a meditation on the nature of human endurance, the complexity of moral choice, and the terrible price that might be paid for daring to challenge the natural world. The emigrants who had set out for California with such hope and determination had left behind a story that would echo through American consciousness for generations to come, a reminder of both the best and worst of human nature revealed under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The final rescue from the Sierra Nevada was completed on April 17, 1847. When the last survivor was brought down from the mountains. Of the 87 people who had become trapped in the snow, 48 had survived the ordeal, a death toll that represented nearly half of the original party. The mathematics of survival were stark and unforgiving.
Entire families had been wiped out, while others had lost only 1 or 2 members to the mountain's cruel arithmetic. The Reed family, whose patriarch had been banished from the wagon train in anger and frustration, emerged from their ordeal intact. James Reed's desperate journey to California for help had ultimately saved his wife Margaret and their 4 children, though the reunion was shadowed by the knowledge of what they had all endured during their separation. The children, Virginia, Patty, James Jr. and Tommy, would carry the memory of their winter in the mountains for the rest of their lives, but they would also carry the knowledge that their family's love had survived even the most extreme circumstances.
The Breen family, whose patriarch, Patrick, had documented their ordeal in his diary, had also survived largely intact. The Irish immigrant, whose steady faith had provided stability during their confinement, found his devotion rewarded with the survival of his wife and most of his children. The words he had scratched by firelight during the darkest days of winter would become one of the most important historical records of their experience, preserving for future generations the daily reality of their struggle. The Donner families, for whom the entire party would be remembered, had paid the heaviest price. George Donner died during the final rescue attempt, his infected hand having doomed him to a slow decline that ended in the mountains he had sought to cross. His wife, Tamsin, who had remained behind to care for him, also perished in the spring snows, leaving their children orphaned but alive. The younger Donner children were taken in by other families, their future secured by the same spirit of mutual aid that had sustained the survivors through their darkest hours. The immediate aftermath of the rescue saw the survivors scattered across California, some settling in the San Francisco Bay Area, others in the Central Valley, and a few returning east to rebuild their lives in more familiar surroundings. The dream of California prosperity that had motivated their original journey was largely forgotten in the struggle to simply rebuild their lives from nothing. The emigrants, who had set out with carefully planned resources and clear goals, found themselves starting over with only the clothes on their backs and the traumatic memories of their experience. The physical recovery of the survivors was a slow and difficult process. Months of malnutrition and exposure had left permanent damage that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. The children showed remarkable resilience, their young bodies adapting more quickly to adequate nutrition and warmth, but many of the adults would struggle with the long-term effects of their ordeal. The simple act of eating normal quantities of food was initially difficult for people whose stomachs had shrunk and whose digestive systems had adapted to starvation. The psychological recovery proved even more challenging than the physical healing. The survivors found themselves haunted by memories of their experience, and many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares, depression, and anxiety that plagued them were not well understood in their time, and the survivors were largely left to cope with these effects on their own. The stigma attached to their story made it difficult for them to seek help or even to speak openly about their experience. As you imagine yourself standing once again at the edge of the Sierra Nevada, the morning mist rising from valleys that have witnessed both triumph and tragedy, you might feel the weight of the story that has unfolded in these mountains.
The granite peaks that catch the first light of dawn are the same ones that look down upon the Donner Party during their 87 days of desperation, and the silence that surrounds you is the same silence that pressed against the walls of their crude shelters during that terrible winter of 1846-47. The transformation of their story from personal tragedy to American legend began almost immediately after the rescue. Newspaper accounts, often sensationalized and inaccurate, spread across the country within weeks of their arrival in California. The emigrants who had sought anonymity and the chance to rebuild their lives found themselves thrust into the public spotlight, their private ordeal becoming a source of public fascination and moral instruction.
The survivors themselves had varying relationships with their newfound notoriety. Some, like Virginia Reed, would eventually write detailed accounts of their experience, feeling a responsibility to correct the misconceptions and sensationalized versions that circulated in the press. Others retreated into silence, preferring to let their ordeal remain in the past and focusing entirely on building new lives for themselves and their children. The choice of whether to embrace or reject their role in history became another burden that the survivors had to bear. The California that received the survivors was itself in the midst of dramatic change. The gold rush, which began just a year after their rescue, transformed the territory into a magnet for fortune seekers from around the world. The emigrants, who had suffered so much to reach California, found themselves in a land that was changing almost as rapidly as they were themselves. The quiet agricultural paradise they had envisioned was being replaced by a booming, chaotic society that offered both opportunities and new challenges. Several of the survivors found success in this new California, using the determination and resilience they had developed during their ordeal to build prosperous lives. James Reed became a successful businessman and played a role in the development of San Jose, while other survivors established farms, businesses, and families that would become part of California's growing population. Their success was hard-won, built on the foundation of having survived the worst that fate could offer. The children who had survived the ordeal grew up to become productive members of California society, though they carried with them always the memory of their experience in the mountains. Many of them rarely spoke of their ordeal, even to their own children, but the lessons they had learned about the fragility of life and the importance of family bonds influenced their approach to their own families and communities. The strength they had shown as children in the face of unimaginable hardship served them well as adults, navigating the ordinary challenges of life. The site of their winter camp gradually returned to its natural state as the years passed. The crude shelters that had provided minimal protection during their ordeal slowly rotted away, and the artifacts they had left behind were scattered by time and weather. But the lake that had been their prison was renamed Donner Lake, and the mountain pass they had failed to cross in time became known as Donner Pass, ensuring that their story would be remembered by every traveler who followed their route. The moral complexity of their story continues to challenge those who encounter it more than a century and a half later. The emigrants were forced to make choices that cannot be easily categorized as either right or wrong, but rather must be understood in the context of extreme circumstances that few people have ever faced. Their experience serves as a reminder that moral judgment is complicated by the realities of survival, and that the luxury of maintaining absolute principles is often dependent on the security of adequate resources and favorable circumstances. The broader significance of their story extends beyond their individual tragedy to illuminate the costs and consequences of Western expansion.
The Donner Party's ordeal was not unique in its suffering, but rather representative of the risks that thousands of families accepted when they chose to leave their established lives for the uncertainties of the frontier. Their experience serves as a reminder that the settlement of the western United States was not simply a story of progress and opportunity, but also involved genuine hardship and real sacrifice. The environmental lessons embedded in their story remain relevant in an age of climate change and environmental uncertainty. The Sierra Nevada that trapped the Donner Party was not malevolent, but simply indifferent to human needs and human timelines. The emigrants learned that natural systems operate according to their own rhythms and requirements, and that human success depends on understanding and adapting to those systems rather than attempting to dominate them. Their experience serves as a reminder of the importance of humility in the face of natural forces that are larger and more powerful than human ambition. The psychological insights revealed by their experience continue to inform our understanding of human behavior under stress. The emigrants demonstrated both the remarkable adaptability of the human mind and its vulnerability to extreme circumstances. Their coping mechanisms, their social interactions, and their individual responses to crisis provide a window into the complex processes by which human beings maintain their sanity and their humanity when faced with circumstances that challenge the very foundations of their existence. As the seasons continue their ancient cycle at Donner Lake, the snow falling and melting according to patterns that have been established for millennia, the physical traces of their ordeal have gradually disappeared. The emigrants who challenged the mountain's barriers discovered that the natural world operates according to its own logic, indifferent to human needs and human timelines. Their experience serves as a reminder that the relationship between human beings and the natural world is not one of dominance, but of negotiation, and that the terms of that negotiation are ultimately set by forces larger and more enduring than human civilization. The story of the Donner Party's 87 days of desperation in the Sierra Nevada has become more than just a historical account. It has become a parable about the human condition, a meditation on the nature of survival, and a reminder of the thin line that separates the civilized from the primitive. The emigrants who set out with such hope and determination discovered that human beings are capable of both remarkable endurance and disturbing compromise, and that the full range of human nature is revealed most clearly when all external supports are stripped away. Their legacy endures not simply as a cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier travel, but as a testament to the complex nature of human courage and the price that might be paid for daring to pursue one's dreams in the face of impossible odds. The mountain that was their prison and their testing ground continues to stand, unchanged and eternal, a reminder that some challenges are larger than human ambition, and that true wisdom lies in understanding our place within the larger patterns of existence. In the end, the story of the Donner Party speaks to something fundamental about the human experience, our capacity for both nobility and degradation, our ability to endure beyond all reasonable expectations, and our eternal struggle to maintain our humanity in the face of circumstances that threaten to strip it away. The emigrants who faced that terrible winter in the Sierra Nevada left behind more than just a survival story. They left behind a mirror in which we can see reflected the full complexity of what it means to be human when tested by the ultimate extremes of existence. The transformation of their story from routine migration to legendary ordeal was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather the accumulation of small delays and seemingly minor decisions that ultimately proved fatal. The choice to take the Hastings cutoff, the time lost in the Wasatch Mountains, the breakdown of social cohesion that led to violence and banishment, Each of these moments represented a step further from the familiar world they had known and deeper into circumstances that would test the very limits of human endurance. The winter that trapped them in the Sierra Nevada revealed both the fragility and resilience of human civilization. The emigrants discovered that the social bonds, moral principles, and cultural practices that had governed their lives were not as solid as they had believed. When stripped of the comforts and securities of their former existence, they were forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of human behavior and the price of survival. The answers they found were not always comfortable, but they were profoundly human in their complexity and contradiction.
The psychological journey that accompanied their physical ordeal was perhaps even more significant than the suffering they endured. The emigrants learned to live with hunger as a constant companion, to find meaning in the smallest gestures of kindness, and to maintain hope in circumstances that seemed to offer little reason for optimism. They discovered reserves of strength and endurance they had never known they possessed. But they also learned that human beings are capable of actions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The children who survived the ordeal carried with them a unique understanding of both human vulnerability and human resilience. Their experience had taught them that the security most people take for granted is actually quite fragile. But it had also shown them that human beings can endure far more than they might have believed possible. The lessons they learned in the mountains would influence their entire lives, shaping their approach to challenges and their appreciation for the simple pleasures of warmth, food, and safety. The moral complexity of their story continues to challenge those who encounter it more than a century and a half later. The emigrants were forced to make choices that cannot be easily categorized as either right or wrong, but rather must be understood in the context of extreme circumstances that few people have ever faced. Their experience serves as a reminder that moral judgment is complicated by the realities of survival, and that the luxury of maintaining absolute principles is often dependent on the security of adequate resources and favorable circumstances. The physical landscape that witnessed their ordeal remains largely unchanged, though the human presence in the Sierra Nevada has grown dramatically since their time. The lake where they spent their terrible winter still freezes each year. The mountains still accumulate snow to depths that would challenge modern travelers, and the passes still present obstacles that require careful planning and adequate preparation. The railroad that now crosses the mountains follows a route that passes near their winter camp, and the highway that carries thousands of travelers each day runs through the same terrain that nearly claimed their lives. The story of the Donner Party has become woven into the fabric of American mythology, taking its place alongside other tales of frontier hardship and pioneer determination. Their experience has been retold countless times in books, films, and popular culture, often with emphasis on the most sensational aspects of their ordeal. The complexity of their actual experience, which involved both admirable courage and disturbing necessity, has sometimes been lost in the retelling, but the essential power of their story continues to resonate with audiences who recognize in their struggle something universal about the human condition. The descendants of the survivors have carried the burden of their ancestors' experience for generations, finding themselves defined by events they never witnessed, but which continue to influence their family identity. The pride they feel in their ancestors' survival is complicated by the knowledge of what survival required, and the complexity of their inheritance reflects the moral ambiguity that characterized the original experience. Their family history serves as a reminder that the past is never simply past, but continues to shape the present in ways that are both obvious and subtle. The scientific and historical study of their ordeal has contributed to our understanding of human physiology and psychology under extreme stress.
the detailed records kept by some of the survivors have provided valuable information about the progression of starvation, the effects of prolonged exposure to cold, and the psychological adaptations required for survival in extreme circumstances. Their experience has become a case study in human endurance that continues to inform research in fields ranging from medicine to anthropology. The broader significance of their story extends beyond their individual tragedy to illuminate the costs and consequences of westward expansion. The Donner Party's ordeal was not unique in its suffering, but rather representative of the risks that thousands of families accepted when they chose to leave their established lives for the uncertainties of the frontier. Their experience serves as a reminder that the settlement of the American West was not simply a story of progress and opportunity, but also involved genuine hardship and real sacrifice. The environmental lessons embedded in their story remain relevant in an age of climate change and environmental degradation. The Sierra Nevada that trapped the Donner Party was not malevolent, but simply indifferent to human needs and human timelines. The emigrants learned that natural systems operate according to their own rhythms and requirements, and that human success depends on understanding and adapting to those systems rather than attempting to dominate them. Their experience serves as a reminder of the importance of humility in the face of natural forces that are larger and more powerful than human ambition. The questions raised by their story about the relationship between civilization and wilderness continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about environmental protection and human development. The emigrants who were trapped in the mountains discovered that the boundary between civilization and wilderness is not as clear as they had believed, and that the security provided by human society is dependent on a complex web of relationships with the natural world. Their experience suggests that true security comes not from dominating nature, but from understanding our place within natural systems and learning to live in harmony with them. The spiritual and philosophical implications of their experience have been explored by writers and thinkers who recognize in their story a meditation on the meaning of suffering and the nature of human endurance. The emigrants were forced to confront fundamental questions about the purpose of existence and the value of life. And their responses to these questions reflect the full range of human approaches to existential crisis. Some found their faith strengthened by their ordeal, while others discovered that their beliefs were inadequate to explain or comfort them in their extremity.
The psychological insights revealed by their experience continue to inform our understanding of human behavior under stress. The emigrants demonstrated both the remarkable adaptability of the human mind and its vulnerability to extreme circumstances. Their coping mechanisms, their social interactions, and their individual responses to crisis provide a window into the complex processes by which human beings maintain their sanity and their humanity when faced with circumstances that challenge the very foundations of their existence. As the seasons continue their ancient cycle at Donner Lake, the snow falling and melting according to patterns that have been established for millennia, the physical traces of their ordeal have gradually disappeared. The shelters that provided minimal protection during their winter of desperation have long since rotted away, and the artifacts they left behind have been scattered by time and weather. But the story of what they endured and what they became continues to live in the consciousness of those who encountered their experience. The Sierra Nevada stands as it always has, beautiful and terrible in its indifference to human dreams and human suffering. The emigrants who challenged its barriers discovered that the natural world operates according to its own logic, indifferent to human needs and human timelines. Their experience serves as a reminder that the relationship between human beings and the natural world is not one of dominance, but of negotiation, and that the terms of that negotiation are ultimately set by forces larger and more enduring than human civilization. The story of the Donner Party's 87 days of desperation in the Sierra Nevada has become more than just a historical account. It has become a parable about the human condition, a meditation on the nature of survival, and a reminder of the thin line that separates the civilized from the primitive. The emigrants who set out with such hope and determination discovered that human beings are capable of both remarkable endurance and disturbing compromise, and that the full range of human nature is revealed most clearly when all external supports are stripped away. Their legacy endures not simply as a cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier travel, but as a testament to the complex nature of human courage and the price that might be paid for daring to pursue one's dreams in the face of impossible odds. The mountain that was their prison and their testing ground continues to stand, unchanged and eternal, a reminder that some challenges are larger than human ambition, and that true wisdom lies in understanding our place within the larger patterns of existence. In the end, the story of the Donner Party's 87 days of desperation in the Sierra Nevada speaks to something fundamental about the human experience, our capacity for both nobility and degradation, our ability to endure beyond all reasonable expectations, and our eternal struggle to maintain our humanity in the face of circumstances that threaten to strip it away. The emigrants who faced that terrible winter in the Sierra Nevada left behind more than just a survival story. They left behind a mirror in which we can see reflected the full complexity of what it means to be human when tested by the ultimate extremes of existence.